At 1:14 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Private Donald Burgett jumped from a C-47 aircraft into the darkness over Normandy, carrying a rifle that weighed 9.5 pounds and held the power to change the mathematics of modern warfare. The 19-year-old paratrooper from Detroit, Michigan was assigned to a company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. As his parachute opened above the French countryside, he clutched his M1 Garand rifle against his chest. He had trained with this weapon for months at Fort Benning, Georgia, learning to strip and reassemble it blindfolded, firing thousands of rounds until the 8-shot clip became an extension of his own hands. Burgett landed in water that night, somewhere near Ravensville, miles from his intended drop zone. His rifle got wet. German soldiers were everywhere in the darkness, and scattered American paratroopers were fighting isolated engagements across the Norman hedgerows. In the chaos of those first hours, Burgett discovered something that would save his life repeatedly over the next 11 months of combat. His wet rifle worked just fine. The M1 Garand could do something no standard-issue infantry rifle in any other army in the world could do. It could fire 8 rounds as fast as Burgett could pull the trigger. In the confused, close-range fighting that characterized the Normandy hedgerows, that capability meant the difference between life and death. What happened in those hedgerows, and in the forests and frozen fields that followed, would prove that sometimes the difference between victory and defeat comes down to how fast a man can pull a trigger. The problem was not that American soldiers could not shoot straight. They could. The United States had a long tradition of marksmanship, stretching back to the Revolutionary War, when American riflemen had picked off British officers at ranges that seemed impossible. The problem was that they could not shoot fast enough. In 1917, when the United States entered the First World War, American infantry carried the M1903 Springfield rifle. It was a fine weapon, derived from the German Mauser design that had set the standard for military rifles at the turn of the century. The Springfield was accurate out to 1,000 yards in the hands of a trained marksman. It was reliable in mud and rain and snow. It chambered the powerful .30 caliber cartridge that could punch through cover and drop a man at ranges well beyond what iron sights could practically aim. But the Springfield had one critical limitation that it shared with every other standard-issue infantry rifle in the world. After every shot, the soldier had to take his hand off the trigger, reach up to the bolt handle on the right side of the receiver, rotate it upward to unlock the action, pull it back to eject the spent brass cartridge, push it forward to strip a new round from the magazine and chamber it, rotate it down to lock the action, reacquire his sight picture, and then fire again. A well-trained soldier could perform this sequence and fire 15 aimed shots per minute with the Springfield. A truly exceptional marksman, someone who had drilled the motions until they were as automatic as breathing, might manage 20. But those numbers assumed perfect conditions. They assumed a clean weapon with a smooth action. They assumed steady hands and clear eyes. They assumed no one was shooting back. In combat, everything changed. Soldiers flinched at incoming fire. Mud jammed bolt mechanisms that had worked perfectly on the training range. Fear made fingers clumsy and eyes unfocused. The practical rate of fire dropped to perhaps 10 or 12 rounds per minute, sometimes less, sometimes much less. Meanwhile, the enemy was not standing still waiting to be shot. The enemy was maneuvering, flanking, closing distance for the bayonet charge that could sweep a position clean in seconds. The lessons of the First World War were written in blood across the fields of France and Belgium. Machine guns had dominated the battlefield, their sustained fire creating killing zones that no infantry could cross. But machine guns were heavy, requiring teams of several men to carry and operate. They required supply lines to keep them fed with ammunition. They were fixed positions that could not move with advancing infantry. They could hold ground, but they could not take it. The armies that fought the Great War tried to solve this problem in different ways. The Germans developed submachine guns for trench clearing, compact automatic weapons that could spray pistol cartridges at close range. The French experimented with automatic rifles. The British trained their soldiers to work their bolt-action Lee Enfields so fast that German troops sometimes mistook the rapid fire for machine guns, but none of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem. The standard infantry rifle, the weapon carried by the majority of soldiers in every army, was too slow. What the army needed was a way to give every rifleman the firepower of a small machine gun team. They needed a rifle that could fire as fast as a man could pull the trigger, without the complexity of a fully automatic weapon, without the weight of extra ammunition that full auto demanded, without the accuracy problems that came from uncontrolled recoil. They needed a semi-automatic rifle. In 1919, the War Department issued a requirement for a new infantry rifle. The specifications were demanding. The rifle had to be semi-automatic, meaning it would automatically eject the spent cartridge and chamber a new round after each shot, but fire only one bullet per trigger pull. It had to be reliable enough to function in mud, sand, snow, and jungle, in conditions ranging from -40 degrees to tropical humidity. It had to be accurate enough for aimed fire at 500 yards, as accurate as the bolt-action Springfield it would replace. It had to be durable enough to survive the abuse that soldiers inflicted on their weapons, the drops and impacts and neglect that were inevitable in combat. And it had to be simple enough for an 18-year-old draftee with no mechanical background to learn in basic training. The requirement sat on desks in Washington for years while engineers and inventors across the country submitted designs. Most failed at the first hurdle. The mechanisms jammed when dirt entered the action. The parts broke under repeated firing. The rifles were too heavy for practical infantry use, or too complicated for mass production, or too expensive for the Army's limited peacetime budget. By 1930, the War Department had spent 11 years and tested dozens of prototypes without finding a single weapon that met all requirements. The Army was running out of time. Storm clouds were gathering in Europe, where Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party was gaining power in Germany. In Asia, Japan was expanding aggressively into China. Another war was coming. Everyone with eyes to see knew it, and American infantry still carried rifles designed before the Wright brothers flew at Kitty Hawk. The greatest industrial nation on earth was preparing to fight the next war with the weapons of the last one. Then a quiet engineer at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts solved the problem. John Cantius Garand was born on January 1, 1888, on a small farm near Saint-Remy, Quebec, about 17 miles south of Montreal. He was one of 12 children, 6 boys and 6 girls, born to a French-Canadian farming family. All 6 boys shared the first name Jean le Baptiste, following Catholic tradition, but each went by a different middle name. John was the only one who used the anglicized version of Jean as his primary name. His mother died in 1896 when John was 8 years old. His father moved the family south to Jewett City, Connecticut, seeking work in the textile mills that dotted the New England landscape. Young John went to work immediately, sweeping floors in a factory for wages that helped support his large family. He had no formal engineering education. He never attended college. He never took classes in mechanical design or metallurgy or thermodynamics. He learned English on the factory floor, listening to the other workers, picking up words and phrases, teaching himself to read from newspapers and technical manuals. He studied the machines around him with the intensity of a scholar, watching how the gears meshed, how the cams lifted and fell, how power was transmitted from the steam engines through shafts and belts to the spindles and looms. By 18, Garand was working as a machinist, operating the precision equipment that shaped metal into parts. He had discovered a talent for understanding how things worked and how they could work better. He took correspondence courses in engineering, studying at night after long days at the factory. By his mid-20s, he had landed a job at Brown and Sharp, a prestigious precision tool-making company in Providence, Rhode Island. The experience he gained there, working with tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, would prove essential for his later work. Garand was fascinated by firearms. He spent his spare time at shooting galleries, first in Providence and later on Broadway in New York City when he moved there for another machining job. He was not just practicing his aim. He was studying how guns worked, examining the mechanisms, thinking about how they could be improved. He saw the limitations of existing designs and began sketching ideas for better ones. In 1917, When America entered the First World War, Garand submitted a design for a light machine gun to the United States Navy. The design was rejected, deemed unsuitable for military use, but someone in the Bureau of Ordnance recognized talent when they saw it. They offered Garand a job as a weapons designer at the National Bureau of Standards in Washington. A year and a half later, on November 4, 1919, Garand was transferred to the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. The Armory had been the center of American military small arms production since George Washington himself ordered its establishment in 1777. Now it would become the center of Garand's life. He was 31 years old when he arrived. He would spend the next 34 years in that building, and he would never patent any of his inventions for personal profit. He believed his work belonged to the American people who had adopted him. The assignment was simple in concept. Design a semi-automatic rifle that would replace the bolt-action Springfield M1903. The execution was anything but simple. Other designers had attempted semi-automatic rifles before. Most used one of two operating principles. Recoil-operated designs used the rearward movement of the barrel or bolt under recoil to cycle the action. Gas-operated designs used some of the expanding gas from the burning gunpowder to push a piston that would cycle the action. Both approaches had problems. Recoil systems tended to be complicated and sensitive to ammunition variations. Gas systems tended to foul with carbon residue and jam. Garand's first major breakthrough came in 1924 when he developed an improved gas-operated system. His design captured gas from near the muzzle of the barrel and used it to push a long operating rod that ran beneath the barrel back toward the receiver. This rod was connected to the bolt, and its rearward movement rotated and unlocked the bolt, extracted and ejected the spent cartridge, and compressed a spring. When the gas pressure dissipated, the spring pushed everything forward again, stripping a fresh round from the magazine and chambering it. The concept was elegant, but the execution required years of refinement. Garand tested different piston designs, varying the diameter and stroke length. He experimented with different gas port locations along the barrel, measuring how the pressure curve changed as the bullet traveled. He tried different operating rod configurations, seeking the perfect balance between reliable cycling and smooth operation. He failed hundreds of times. Springs broke under repeated stress. Pistons jammed when carbon built up in the gas cylinder. Operating rods bent when soldiers dropped their rifles. Each failure taught him something. He kept notebooks filled with measurements, calculations, observations. Every test was documented. Every problem was analyzed. He worked methodically, testing one variable at a time, isolating problems, finding solutions. He was not a flashy inventor who relied on inspiration. He was a systematic engineer who relied on data. The other engineers at Springfield called him quiet and shy. He rarely spoke in meetings unless he had something specific to contribute. He avoided publicity and declined interviews. He spent his time at his workbench, surrounded by parts and tools, endlessly tinkering with mechanisms that did not work quite right. They also called him brilliant. John Garand said a design would work. It worked. By 1932, after 13 years of development, Garand had a working prototype that met all of the Army's demanding requirements. The rifle used an 8-round on-block clip, a metal frame that held the cartridges in a double row. The clip was inserted from the top of the receiver, pushed down into the fixed magazine and held in place by a catch. When the last round was fired, the empty clip was automatically ejected with a distinctive metallic ping, and the bolt locked open, ready for a fresh clip to be inserted. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds fully loaded, about a pound heavier than the Springfield M1903 it would replace. It was 43.6 inches long, about the same as the Springfield. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge that American soldiers had used since 1906, the same powerful round that fed the Browning machine guns and the Springfield rifles. This meant the Army would not need to produce a new type of ammunition, a critical consideration given the vast stockpiles of .30-06 cartridges already in inventory. The original design had called for a smaller caliber, the .276 Peterson, which offered reduced recoil and allowed soldiers to carry more ammunition. but General Douglas MacArthur, then the Army Chief of Staff, personally intervened to mandate the .30-06 caliber. He argued that existing ammunition stocks should not be wasted, and that American infantry should carry the same powerful round that had served them in the previous war. Garand redesigned his rifle accordingly. In the hands of a trained soldier, the M1 Garand could fire 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. That was not the theoretical maximum rate of fire, which was much higher. That was the practical rate at which a soldier could acquire targets, aim, fire, and repeat while maintaining accuracy. 40 to 50 aimed rounds per minute. That was nearly 3 times the rate of fire of any bolt-action rifle in the world. On January 9, 1936, the United States Army officially adopted the M1 rifle as its standard infantry weapon. The adoption came after years of competitive trials against other designs, including rifles submitted by major firearms manufacturers. Garand's design had proven more reliable, more accurate, and more durable than any competitor. John Garand had spent 17 years designing the rifle. He received no royalties from its adoption. As a government employee, his inventions belonged to the government. A bill was later introduced in Congress to award him $100,000 in appreciation for his contribution to national defense. It failed to pass. He never complained. He continued working at Springfield Armory, refining his design, solving problems that emerged during production and field use. The first production M1 Garand was successfully proof-fired, function-fired, and fired for accuracy on July 21, 1937. But production was painfully slow. The rifle was complex, with over 70 individual parts that had to be machined to precise tolerances. Manufacturing required specialized equipment and trained workers. By September of 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and started the Second World War, Springfield Armory was producing only 100 rifles per day. At that rate, it would take years to equip the expanding American military. By January of 1941, production had increased to 600 rifles per day as new equipment came online and workers became more skilled. Winchester Repeating Arms Company was awarded a contract to produce additional rifles, further increasing output. By the time Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States Army considered itself fully equipped with M1 Garands. But the Marine Corps was not fully equipped. Many Army units still had not received the new rifles and were training with the older Springfield M1903s. The race to arm American infantry for the coming global war had only just begun. The men who would carry the M1 Garand into battle did not fully understand what they had been given until they used it against an enemy who expected something else entirely. Staff Sergeant O.B. Hill was a squad leader in the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. After completing jump school, he reported to the 508th at Camp Landing, Florida, where he was issued an M1 Garand. That was the rifle he would carry all the way through the Normandy campaign. On the night of June 5, 1944, Hill's commander encouraged the paratroopers to carry as much ammunition as they could. Hill strapped on as many extra bandoliers as he could manage, the heavy clips weighing down his combat harness alongside his grenades, first aid kit, and other gear. When his C-47 crossed the French coast and the green light came on, he jumped into the darkness over Normandy. Hill landed in water, like many paratroopers that night. The carefully planned drop zones had scattered across miles of Norman countryside, and men came down in flooded fields, orchards, and hedgerows far from their intended positions. His rifle got wet. In the darkness, surrounded by German forces, that wet rifle could have meant death. But the M1 Garand worked. Hill later recalled that although his rifle was soaked from the water landing, it functioned without problems throughout the Normandy campaign. The gas operating system that John Garand had spent 17 years perfecting proved reliable even under conditions that would have jammed lesser weapons. For the next 5 days, Hill fought through the hedgerows of Normandy with his squad, engaging German patrols, assaulting defensive positions, and struggling to link up with other scattered American units. By the time a patrol from the 90th Infantry Division finally relieved his group on the 5th day after D-Day, Hill was down to 7 rounds of ammunition. He had fired hundreds of rounds from his M1 Garand in 5 days of nearly continuous combat, The experience taught him something important about the rifle. When he was later given a choice of weapons as a non-commissioned officer, he could have selected a Thompson submachine gun, a regular carbine, or a folding stock M1 1 carbine. He chose to continue carrying the M1 Garand. It was, he said, an efficient weapon that had gotten him through some tough situations. Around Hill and thousands of other American soldiers in Normandy, the mathematics of infantry combat were being rewritten. German units who engaged American paratroopers and infantry reported unexpected volumes of rifle fire from what appeared to be small groups of men. The distinctive ripping sound of German machine guns was being answered by sustained volleys that sounded like automatic weapons. The Germans had already encountered the M1 Garand in North Africa and Italy before the Normandy invasion. German intelligence officers had been receiving reports since 1942 that did not match their expectations. American units seemed to have more automatic weapons than their tables of organization indicated. Fire from what appeared to be a single squad sounded like fire from multiple machine guns. German soldiers who had grown accustomed to the measured crack-crack-crack of bolt-action fire were reporting sustained volleys that suggested much larger forces. Some German officers suspected the Americans were using some new type of automatic rifle they had not seen before. They were half right. The M1 Garand was not fully automatic. It fired only 1 round per trigger pull, unlike a true machine gun. But 50 aimed rounds per minute, multiplied by 8 or 10 riflemen in a squad, created a volume of fire that sounded like automatic weapons to ears trained to expect something different. The psychological impact was immediate and significant. German soldiers who had been trained to advance under covering fire from their own machine guns found themselves pinned down by American rifle fire alone. Tactics that had worked brilliantly in Poland and France and the early campaigns in Russia suddenly seemed inadequate. The Americans were not supposed to be able to do this. By 1943, German intelligence had fully identified the M1 Garand and understood its capabilities. Reports circulated through Wehrmacht units describing the American semi-automatic rifle, its 8% round capacity, its rate of fire, its reliability. The German Army Ordnance Office officially designated the captured American weapon as Selbstladegewehr 251A, meaning self-loading rifle 251 American. The designation confirmed that Germans had captured, catalogued, and tested M1 Garands in significant numbers. The German military attempted to respond, but their efforts were hampered by industrial limitations and doctrinal conservatism. The Gewehr 41, a semi-automatic rifle intended to counter the American advantage, had been in development since before the war. 2 versions were produced, one by Walther and one by Mauser. The Walther design proved more reliable and was adopted in small numbers, but both versions suffered from complicated manufacturing processes and sensitivity to dirt. The gas trap system used in early versions fouled quickly and required frequent cleaning. Frontline troops who received them often abandoned them in favor of the familiar K98K. The improved Gewehr 43 entered service in 1943 with a simpler gas system copied from the Soviet S-5T40 rifle. It was more reliable than its predecessor and earned respect from soldiers who used it. But production never approached the scale needed to equip the entire infantry. German factories were under constant Allied bombing. Raw materials were scarce. Skilled workers had been drafted into the military. By the end of the war, only about 400,000 Gewehr 43 rifles had been produced, compared to over 4 million M1 Garands manufactured during the war years alone. The Germans never achieved the mass adoption of semi-automatic rifles that the Americans had accomplished before the war even began. German commanders faced a tactical dilemma. Their infantry doctrine had been built around the machine gun as the primary source of firepower. The MG-34 and MG-42 were superb weapons, arguably the best machine guns of the war, capable of laying down devastating suppressive fire. But doctrine assumed that riflemen would be engaging targets at ranges where the bolt-action rifle's slow rate of fire was not a critical disadvantage. Against American infantry armed with Garands, that assumption proved dangerously wrong. German soldiers in Italy and France reported that American squads could pin down positions that should have required much larger forces to suppress. Tactics that had worked against British and Soviet troops, who still used bolt-action rifles as their primary infantry weapons, failed against Americans who could match one machine gun's worth of suppressive fire with a handful of riflemen. The psychological effect was profound. German soldiers began to approach engagements with American infantry differently, more cautiously, more defensively. Germany also developed the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first true assault rifle, which combined the automatic fire capability of a submachine gun with the range and accuracy of a rifle. It fired an intermediate cartridge, smaller and less powerful than the standard rifle round, but more powerful than a pistol cartridge. This allowed controllable automatic fire while still being effective at several hundred meters. It was a revolutionary weapon that would influence firearms design for the next 80 years. Adolf Hitler himself became an enthusiast after seeing the weapon demonstrated, renaming it from the bureaucratic designation MP-43 to the more dramatic Sturmgewehr, meaning storm rifle or assault rifle. The name stuck and became the basis for the modern term assault rifle. German soldiers who received the weapon loved it. On the Eastern Front, Soviet intelligence reported that German units equipped with the Sturmgewehr were significantly more effective in defensive combat. But the weapon came too late, and in too few numbers to change the fundamental equation. Production began in 1943, but only reached significant numbers in 1944. By the end of the war, approximately 425,000 had been manufactured. That sounds like a large number, until you consider that Germany fielded millions of soldiers and most of them still carried bolt-action rifles when the war ended. When American and German infantry met in the decisive battles of 1944 and 45, in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the forests of the Hurtgen, in the frozen fields of the Bulge, the Germans still mostly carried bolt-action rifles. The Americans carried Garands. That difference did not win the war by itself. Nothing in war is that simple. But it contributed to a pattern of American tactical superiority in infantry combat that helped tip the balance. On June 6, 1944, approximately 160,000 Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. About half were American. The majority of American infantrymen carried M1 Garand rifles. The landings at Omaha Beach were a catastrophe that nearly turned into a complete disaster. German defenders from the 352nd Infantry Division held prepared positions on the bluffs overlooking the beach. They had clear fields of fire across a stretch of open sand that offered no cover. Their machine guns were pre-registered on the waterline, on the beach obstacles, on every piece of terrain where landing troops might seek shelter. The first wave hit the beach at 6:30 in the morning. Within 10 minutes, companies that had landed with over 200 men had been reduced to dozens. Landing craft were destroyed by artillery before reaching shore. Some opened their ramps in water over the heads of the men inside, and soldiers drowned under the weight of their equipment before they could fire a shot. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down by machine gun fire with no cover except the bodies of their comrades, and the steel obstacles the Germans had planted to stop tanks. In that desperate situation, the M1 Garand proved its worth. Soldiers who survived the initial landing crawled up the beach on their bellies, dragging their rifles through sand and salt water. They found cover behind hedgehog obstacles, behind the seawall, behind anything that would stop a bullet. And they began returning fire. They could not match the German machine guns round for round. No rifle could do that. But they could maintain a volume of fire that forced German gunners to duck, even if only for seconds at a time. Those seconds allowed other men to move, to work their way up the beach, to find better positions. A sergeant would empty a clip at a German position, while a corporal sprinted to a new piece of cover. Then the corporal would fire while the sergeant reloaded and moved. It was not elegant, it was not what they had trained for, it was improvised chaos born of desperation. But it worked because the men had weapons that could fire 8 rounds in rapid succession without requiring them to take their hands off the trigger. A man with a bolt-action rifle could not have maintained that kind of fire while also trying to stay alive and move forward. The Garand made it possible. Captain Joseph Dawson of G Company, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, was among the first American officers to lead men off Omaha Beach and onto the bluffs above. Dawson had landed at the Easy Red sector in the first assault wave, wading through chest-deep water under machine gun fire to reach the sand. He gathered survivors from multiple shattered units and led them in an assault up a draw that offered a route off the killing ground of the beach. Dawson's combat journal, later published as a historical record, documented the chaos and courage of that morning. His men used their M1 Garands to suppress German positions while small groups worked their way up the bluff. The semi-automatic fire allowed them to keep German heads down long enough for soldiers to close the distance and use grenades. By the end of the day, Dawson and his improvised command had secured a section of the bluff that became known as Dawson's Ridge. Similar stories played out across all 5 invasion beaches and in the airborne drop zones inland where American paratroopers had landed in the pre-dawn darkness. The paratroopers carried M1 Garands and M1 carbines, the lighter semi-automatic weapon designed for support troops. When they encountered German patrols in the Norman hedgerows, the firefights were often brief and one-sided. Americans who could fire 50 rounds per minute against Germans who could fire 15 had a decisive advantage in the confused, close-range fighting that characterized the first days of the invasion. General George S. Patton commanded the Third Army during the drive across France in the summer and fall of 1944. He was known for his aggressive tactics, his colorful language, his pearl-handled pistols, and his strong opinions about weapons and equipment. He had little patience for tools that did not work, and generous praise for those that did. On January 26, 1945, while his army was pushing into Germany through the remnants of the Battle of the Bulge, Patton sat down to write a letter to Major General Levin H. Campbell, Jr., the War Department's Chief of Ordnance. Campbell was responsible for everything from hand grenades to 500-pound bombs, the entire spectrum of American military equipment. The letter began with a single sentence that would become one of the most famous quotes in American military history. In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised. Patton was not prone to empty praise. He had seen too much war to be impressed by weapons that looked good on paper but failed in the field. He had commanded troops in North Africa, Sicily, France, and now Germany. He knew what worked and what did not. His endorsement carried weight. He continued in the letter to commend American machine guns, mortars, artillery, and tanks. He praised the entire system of American ordnance production that had equipped his army with the tools of victory. But he reserved his highest praise for the Garand rifle. He had seen what it could do in the hands of his soldiers. He had watched American infantry advance against German positions that would have stopped any army equipped only with bolt-action rifles. The letter was addressed to Campbell, but its real audience was broader. Patton wanted the thousands of workers in American factories to know their work mattered. He wanted the engineers at Springfield Armory to know they had given American soldiers the best rifle in the world. He wanted history to record that the weapon worked. The Battle of the Bulge began on December 16, 1944. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg, hoping to split the American and British armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. It was Hitler's last gamble, an attempt to repeat the stunning success of 1940 when German armor had crashed through the same forest and shattered the Allied defenses. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. American intelligence had failed to detect the massive German build-up opposite the Ardennes. The sector was held by a mix of green divisions fresh from the States and veteran divisions that had been sent there to rest and refit after heavy fighting elsewhere. When the German artillery began falling in the pre-dawn darkness of December 16th, many American units were caught completely by surprise. German infantry infiltrated the lines. Panzer divisions poured through gaps in the defenses. Within days, the German advance had created a huge bulge in the American lines, threatening to cut off entire divisions and collapse the Allied front. In the chaos that followed, small groups of American soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off from their units, fighting for survival against overwhelming numbers. the advantages that American forces normally enjoyed: artillery superiority, air supremacy, armored support, disappeared in the fog and snow that blanketed the Ardennes. The weather grounded Allied aircraft. The narrow forest roads channeled armor into kill zones. Combat came down to infantry against infantry, rifle against rifle. The American soldiers in those frozen forests discovered what their rifle could do when everything else failed. They could not call for airstrikes through the clouds. They could not summon tanks through the snowdrifts. But they could fire 8 rounds as fast as they could pull the trigger, reload in 2 seconds, and fire 8 more. Against Germans who had to work a bolt after every shot, that advantage could mean survival. Private First Class Melvin Biddle of the 517 Parachute Infantry Regiment was among the American soldiers who fought in the desperate defensive battles around Soy and Hotten, Belgium. On December 23 and 24, 1944, Biddle found himself in a series of engagements that would earn him the Medal of Honor. On December 24, Biddle was advancing toward an open field when he spotted 13 enemy soldiers. He opened fire with his M1 Garand, emptying 2 clips at the Germans and killing them all. The semi-automatic fire allowed him to engage multiple targets faster than they could react, faster than any bolt-action rifle would have permitted. Shortly afterward, he found a 14-year-old German soldier roped to a tree. When another American shouted for Biddle to shoot the teenager, he refused and took the boy prisoner instead. Biddle later recalled the bitter cold of those December days, noting that he was not sure he would be able to fire his rifle because his hands were so frozen. But the M1 Garand functioned despite the cold, despite the snow, despite conditions that pushed both men and equipment to their limits. Throughout the ordeal, Biddle suffered not a scratch, though the sleeves of his uniform were pocked with bullet holes. Staff Sergeant O.B. Hill, the paratrooper who had carried his M1 Garand through Normandy, also fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He had cleaned his rifle every chance he got, keeping snow and dirt out of the action as much as possible. He never had any problems with it, even in the miserable conditions of the Ardennes winter. The experience reinforced his confidence in the weapon. The M1 Garand had gotten him through Normandy, it got him through the Bulge, it would get him through to the end of the war. Staff Sergeant Rocky Moretto of the 26th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, fought in the desperate defensive battles between December 17th and 19th, 1944. Years later, he still had vivid memories of constantly using his M1 Garand during 3 days of nearly continuous fighting. At one point, he sighted on a pair of German soldiers charging up a snow-covered rise about 40 feet away and pumped bullets into them. The semi-automatic fire of the Garand allowed him to engage both targets before they could close the distance. Private Donald Bulge, the young paratrooper from Detroit who had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, also fought in the Battle of the Bulge. He was part of the 101st Airborne Division's desperate defense of Bastogne, where surrounded American troops held out against repeated German assaults while awaiting relief. During the fighting around Bastogne, Bulge had his M1 Garand shot out of his hands at least twice. Each time, he found another rifle from a fallen soldier and kept fighting. By the end of the war, he would be one of only 11 men from his original 200-man company to survive from D-Day to 5E Day. He was wounded 3 times. He fought in Normandy, Holland, the Ardennes, and into Germany itself. Through all of it, the M1 Garand was his constant companion. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 6 weeks and cost American forces approximately 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. It was the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in the entire Second World War. The German offensive ultimately failed. The Bulge was eliminated, German forces were pushed back, and the advance into Germany resumed. The M1 Garand did not win the Battle of the Bulge by itself. Nothing in war is that simple. Artillery, armor, air power, when the weather finally cleared, logistics, leadership, and the raw courage of individual soldiers all played critical roles. But the rifle gave American infantry a capability that German infantry could not match. When everything else was equal, or even when the odds were against them, American riflemen could generate more firepower than their enemies expected. John Garand worked at Springfield Armory until his retirement in 1953. He was 65 years old. He had spent 34 years at the armory, nearly all of his adult working life, designing and improving the rifle that bore his name, and developing other weapons that never achieved the same fame. During the Second World War, Springfield Armory and Winchester Repeating Arms Company together produced over 4 million M1 Garand rifles for the war effort. Springfield alone manufactured 3,526,922 rifles, while Winchester contributed 513,880. The scale of this production was unprecedented in the history of firearms manufacturing. Springfield Armory transformed itself from a relatively small government facility into a massive industrial operation. Before the war, the armory employed about 2,000 workers. By 1943, that number had grown to over 18,000. The facility operated 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. Workers who had been machinists, farmers, clerks, and housewives learned to operate the specialized equipment that produced Garand components. The production process required extraordinary precision. The rifle's gas system worked because components were machined to tolerances of a few thousandths of an inch. The bolt had to lock precisely into the receiver. The operating rod had to move smoothly through its channel. Any deviation could cause the rifle to jam, or worse, to fail catastrophically under the pressure of firing. Quality control was rigorous. Every rifle was proof-fired with a high-pressure test cartridge to verify the receiver could handle the stress. Every rifle was function tested to ensure the mechanism cycled properly. Every rifle was accuracy tested to ensure it met the standard of hitting a man-sized target at 300 yards. Rifles that failed any test were rejected and sent back for repair or scrapped. The production peak came in January of 1944, when Springfield alone turned out 122,000 rifles in a single month. That was nearly 4,000 rifles per day, or about 164 per hour, rolling off the production line around the clock. Every 8 minutes or so, another completed M1 Garand was packed for shipment to American forces somewhere in the world. Winchester's contribution was smaller, but still substantial. The company produced over 500,000 Garands between December of 1940 and June of 1945. Winchester workers faced the same challenges as their counterparts at Springfield, learning new skills, maintaining quality standards, and working long hours to meet production quotas. The logistics of supplying these factories was staggering. Each rifle required walnut for the stock, high-grade steel for the receiver and barrel, chrome for the bolt, springs of precise temper, pins and screws of exact dimensions. Raw materials had to be sourced, transported, inspected, and allocated. During a war that demanded steel for ships, tanks, and aircraft, the allocation for rifle production had to compete with 100 other priorities. After the war ended, production slowed but did not stop. When the Korean War began in 1950, the demand for rifles spiked again. Springfield resumed full-scale production, and 2 additional manufacturers, International Harvester and Harrington and Richardson, received contracts to produce Garands. Between them, they manufactured another 1 million rifles, bringing total production across all years to approximately 5.4 million. Garand received numerous awards for his work: the Meritorious Civilian Service Award in 1941, the Medal for Merit on March 28, 1944, one of the highest civilian honors, shared with Albert Hoyt Taylor, the developer of radar, as one of the first 2 recipients of that decoration. He was inducted into the Army Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame in 1973, the year before his death. The citation praised his inventive genius and engineering skills, and noted that because of his initiative, the United States soldier possessed a firepower advantage during the Second World War. He never received any royalties for his invention. As a federal employee, his work belonged to the government. Congress considered awarding him $100,000 in recognition of his contribution, but the bill never passed. Garand never complained publicly about this. He lived modestly in Springfield, visited the armory frequently after his retirement, and seemed content with the knowledge that his rifle had served its purpose. John Garand died on February 16, 1974, in Springfield, Massachusetts. He was 86 years old. He was buried at Hillcrest Park Cemetery, a few miles from the armory where he had spent most of his working life. His obituary mentioned his role in designing the M1 rifle. It did not fully convey what that rifle had meant to the millions of American soldiers who had carried it into battle. The M1 Garand remained the standard American infantry rifle until March 26, 1958, when it was officially replaced by the M14. The M14 was essentially an improved Garand, with a 20-round detachable magazine and selective fire capability, allowing full automatic operation. Garand had been part of the team that designed it, applying the lessons learned from 30 years of Garand production and field use. The legacy of the M1 Garand extends far beyond the rifle itself. Its success proved conclusively that semi-automatic fire was not just possible for standard infantry weapons, but necessary. Within a generation of the Garand's introduction, every major military in the world had adopted semi-automatic or fully automatic rifles as standard issue. The bolt-action rifle, which had dominated battlefields since the 1860s, became obsolete for frontline infantry use. The rifle's influence on firearms design continues to the present day. The M14 rifle that replaced it used Garand's gas operating system. The M1 carbine, a lighter semi-automatic weapon developed during the war, used a related short-stroke piston system. Elements of Garand's design appeared in dozens of later rifles around the world. After the war, surplus M1 Garands were distributed to Allied nations around the world as military aid. They saw service in Korea with South Korean forces, in Greece during the Civil War, in the Philippines, in Turkey, in Denmark, in Italy. Some were sold commercially to civilian shooters. The rifle that had been the backbone of American infantry became an instrument of Cold War foreign policy, arming pro-Western forces on multiple continents. The Civilian Marksmanship Program, established by Congress in 1903 to promote rifle practice among American citizens, became the primary source of surplus Garands for civilian shooters. Over the decades, hundreds of thousands of M1 rifles have been sold through the program to qualified American citizens at prices well below commercial rates. The program continues to this day, and Garands remain available to those who meet the requirements. Collectors and competitive shooters prize the M1 Garand for different reasons. Collectors seek rifles with specific manufacturing dates, rare variations, or documented combat history. They study the subtle differences between Springfield production and Winchester production, between early gas trap models and later gas port models, between standard infantry rifles and sniper variants. Competitive shooters appreciate the rifle for different qualities. The Garand remains legal for many vintage military rifle competitions. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it can still deliver accuracy that matches modern sporting rifles. The John C. Garand match, held annually at the national matches at Camp Perry, Ohio, draws hundreds of competitors who fire original or rebuilt Garands at targets hundreds of yards distant. The competition honors both the designer and the rifle he created. John Garand did not live to see the full scope of his influence. He died believing he had simply done his job, designed a rifle that American soldiers needed, and done it well. He never sought publicity or personal recognition. He never wrote a memoir or gave extensive interviews about his wartime work. He went to work every day at Springfield Armory, a quiet man in a white coat, solving problems, making things work, and going home in the evening like any other factory employee. But the soldiers who carried his rifle into battle knew what he had given them. They knew that the difference between life and death often came down to how fast they could fire and how long they could keep firing. They knew that when German soldiers heard the sustained crack of American rifle fire, something in those Germans' confidence broke. A platoon armed with M1 Garands sounded like a company. A company sounded like a battalion. The mathematics of infantry combat had been fundamentally rewritten by a self-taught machinist from Quebec who never patented his inventions because he believed they belonged to the American people. That is how innovation changes history. Not through grand announcements or official recognition ceremonies, but through the quiet work of dedicated individuals who see a problem clearly and spend years of their lives solving it completely. John Garand saw American soldiers carrying bolt-action rifles into a new kind of war, where firepower would determine who lived and who died. He gave them a weapon that multiplied their effectiveness threefold. He asked for nothing in return except the satisfaction of knowing his work had served its purpose. More than 50 years after his death, his name is still spoken with respect by veterans, collectors, and historians who understand what he accomplished. The rifle that bears his name is still fired on ranges across America, still cherished by those who appreciate fine engineering and important history. And somewhere in a gun safe or a museum display case, an M1 Garand waits, its walnut stock polished by decades of hands, its steel action still cycling smoothly, ready to demonstrate why George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and help us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.